When I was growing up in a small village called Kabile in northwest Somalia, I'm not Somaliland. He's the Somalilander, I'm the Somali. You know, people can disagree intellectually, but still remain to be brothers and fellow citizens. We don't have to kill one another. Okay. And so when I was growing up in that village,
LSC, and we were young, growing up, kind of assistant professors and arguing with the big, kahunas in Somali studies. So it was a very wonderful place, and I'm grateful on behalf of Abdi for the institution to has offered up this facility. And of course, more than any other thing, you, the audience, this is a Friday night. It's a time to put the tools down and begin to relax, and for you to have decided that you want to spend your Friday evening to help us present this case is something that is noteworthy, and we are very grateful, particularly when the topic is also perhaps one of the most perplexing developmental challenges in contemporary Africa. Now, a few brief remarks on scholarship and history, and then I'll hand it over to Abdi. We have divided the labor process. He's going to present the historical part, and I will then consider living in the world today, which is now, this hour and beyond into the future. So, means of self-understanding. The third point I want to make is that the past, tarikhdu, the past speaks to the prevailing challenge of any society. Wixii laga bartay taariikhdii laga soo baxay unbaa hub ku noqon kartaa mustaqbalka dagaalkayga ku gasho. The past speaks to the prevailing challenge, and if the Somali people want to understand themselves, they can't run away, because there is no other place to go except first to dig the historical process and then link it to the present moment. Fourth point about scholarship and history is that ideas are usually powerful, most powerful, during times of extraordinary rapid change and severe bewilderments. And there is nothing more bewildering and rapid change than what has been happening to the Somalis, particularly in the last 35, 40 years, if not a little longer. Let me then just conclude, before I hand to Abdi, two towering figures in the world of scholarship. Unfortunately, they are not Somalis, but they belong to us too, because the scholarship is a universal citizenship. And one of them is a man who spent a lot of time in the House of Commons, long time ago, but from Ireland, I think, originally. And his name was Edmund Burke. And Burke says to us, and I quote, "People will not look forward to posterity who never look backward to their ancestors." Ancestors. Ancestors mean in the sense of what you have inherited from the world. People will not look forward. You can't build a future, he says, in that sense. Who never look back to their ancestors. And a great deal of what Abdi would say speaks to that, even though it is much more perhaps contemporary. The second person is a Spanish philosopher who taught for a long time in one of the major universities in the United States, at Harvard. Philosopher. His name was George Santayana. And in this wonderful volume called The Life of Reason, he teaches us, and he says, and I quote, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." Dadka ilooba waqtiga soo maray iyo taariikhda soo maray ilooba waxay ku celceliyaan qaladaadkoogii ba ku celiyaan. They kept repeating the mistakes, he says. So I will stop here. Abdi therefore will take it from here and give us some compressed sense of the historical process. And when he is done, I will come back and then see if I can pick up the Leninist question about, okay, this is what happened. What's to be done now? Over to you, Abdi.
Can you switch this?
posterity who never look backward to their ancestors. Yeah, abtirsiimo maaha taas ancestors. Ancestors mean in the sense of wixii laga dhaxlay adduunyada, what you have inherited from the world. People will not look forward. You can't build a future, he says, in that sense. Yeah. Who never look back to their ancestors. And a great deal of what Abdi will say speaks to that, even though it is much more perhaps contemporary. The second person is a Spanish philosopher who taught for a long time in one of the major universities in the United States, at Harvard. Philosopher. His name was George Santayana. And in this wonderful volume called The Life of Reason, he teaches us, and he says, and I quote, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." Dadka ilooba waqtiga soo mara iyo taariikhda soo mara ilooba waxay ku celceliyaan qaladaadkoogii bay ku celiyaan. They kept repeating the mistakes, he says. So I will stop here. Abdi therefore will take it from here and give us some compressed sense of the historical process. And when he is done, I will come back and then see if I can pick up the Leninist question about, okay, this is what happened. What's to be done now? Over to you, Abdi.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. I won't repeat what Ahmed said about Ayan, but when I was growing up in a small village called Kabile in northwest Somalia, I'm not Somaliland. He's the Somalilander, I'm the Somali. You know, people can disagree intellectually, but still remain to be brothers and fellow citizens. We don't have to kill one another. Okay. And so when I was growing up in that village, as kids, you know, we were always hungry. When you are growing up, you know, early years and then teens, you know, you want to eat all the time, and there wasn't enough food all the time, as in most parts of the country. And so we used to go to the dry river, where there was sort of a wild fruits called gub-gub, or magub. And so we'll eat that gub. But there was one tree which was taller than all the trees in the village, and in the district for that matter. It was called warmalaliye. Warmalaliye in English will mean sort of a javelin throwing. So the adults used to come to this place and to see who was the best javelin thrower, if they can throw that javelin over the tree. In that sense, Ayan is warmalaliye. He stands tall among us. And so we are exceptionally grateful to you, Ayan. So let me move into the subject, and I will be relatively brief. Most of the stuff will be on slides, so you can partly read if you want to. How do people become a nation? Somali ummad baan nahay ayaa la dhahaa. Somali say we are a nation. But how did we become one? Okay? There were no nation states in Africa. There were no nation states in the world at a certain point. And these have to be constructed. Okay? So for Somalis, tradition and language are the core ideas to the making of a nation. Tonight I'm going to say yes, but no. They are not. If you go to Kenya, if you go to South Africa, people speak different languages and they have different cultures, and so they happen to be a nation nonetheless. And so it's not culture and language. And you can look at the history of Europe and see the same thing. So it's not something peculiarly African. No, it's not. But scholars have thought about this idea and said differently. Two people I would like to quote very briefly tonight is Gellner, who says that nationalism invents nations. So it's not something that sits out there and you just be, if you may. Okay? They invent. Like the locomotive was invented in what's now Great Britain. There was no locomotive before. There was no Great Britain before. So it had to be invented. And then Benedict Anderson, probably the leading scholar on nationalism, wrote a very famous book, probably the best cited book in the social sciences today. And he's not with us any longer. And he says that nationalism invents nations. It's imagined community. So strangers actually can come together and create a nation. So you don't have to have the same culture. You don't have to have the same language. You don't have to have the same food types. You don't have to look like one another, but you can create a nation. Okay? And so, in that regard then, how have people thought about Europe and the Americas as the inventors of nations, modern nation states, versus the rest of the world, particularly Africa and Asia? So here in Europe, here in the United Kingdom, there's a group that rose to prominence called the bourgeoisie. Before the bourgeoisie, there was no United Kingdom. Okay? And there was no British citizenship, period. And so these folks imagined and created new institutions and new communities in the form of political bonds, political ties. Okay. While in the Americas, there were Germans in North America, there were Dutch, New Amsterdam was New York, there were French, there were Spaniards, and so on and so forth. And so they didn't share a culture, they didn't share a language. But a new group rose up in the Americas, white settlers they were, and spearheaded a new identity in the form of common citizenship, chasing the king here out, if you like, popular sovereignty, democracy in that sense, okay, and national flags. There were none before, okay. You may want to remember somebody by the name Mohammed Awal al-Liban, who invented the Somali flag. There was no Somali flag. He invented it. And now, as you will see in some of the brief presentations I'll make, young kids in Mogadishu and young kids in Hargeisa in the old days, before the renegades ran away, right? So, but culture and language was not the driving force either in the Americas or in Europe for that matter. Okay, so something was happening beyond this. What about Africa and Asia? Most scholars in the Western world who write about nationalism said very little about culture per se, okay? But culture played a significant role in Africa and in Asia, largely because these folks in Africa and Asia were dominated by Europeans. India was the jewel of the crown in the British Empire, if you like. So was America to some degree, okay? So the main distinguishing feature between the Asians and the Africans and their imperial powers was their culture and language, of course, but also the power relationships and the domination that existed between them. So you put these two things together and it became like gunpowder for the Africans and the Asians. But the question therefore becomes, what role then in that culture, in that societies, do culture and language play, particularly culture? What role does it play? And so some folks will say, well, it's the thing. We're going to argue, and we argue in this article, that the role culture and language, among other things, play is contingent, not necessary. There are two relationships in the social science, necessary relationships and contingent relationships. If you want to be a professor, there must be a student. If you want to be a doctor, there must be a patient. If you want to be a wife, there must be a husband. If you want to be a master, there must be a subject. These are necessary relationships. One cannot exist without the other. Okay? And so what we say, this is contingent relationship, not necessary relationship in the making of nationalism and ultimately the nation state. So what we will suggest here is that the liberation movements in Africa and in Asia downplayed the cultural differences between the communities there that were part of a colony. There was no country before the colony. There was no India before the colony. There was the Mughal Empire. There was the Safavid Empire. There was the Ottoman Empire in the Muslim world. Okay? So, but they downplayed that differences because the colonialists were using that as an instrument to divide them. Okay? So that's the antithesis to that. And so in the African world, two kinds of groups will emerge abstractly for the time being. And one was what we call those national liberation fronts, which were sort of a civic in orientation. And then there were those national liberation movements that were sectarian. So let me give you an examples of these. The Inkatha Freedom Party of South Africa, not Jacob Zuma, the Zulus, if you like, although the majority of the Zulus actually voted for the ANC. The Inkatha Freedom Party under apartheid want to help the apartheiders create a South Africa that was a concoction of separate entities, cultural entities, which will become a federal system, like the ones the Somalis have, the 4.5. That's what they were getting at. Okay. There was Tshombe in Congo, who was working with the Belgians in what's now the DRC. And then in the Somali case, there was Hizbiyah in the south of the country after the Second World War, particularly the 1950s. So the role of culture in liberation and the post-colony, and I will move here very fast. It's contingent, as we said, okay? And consequently, if the liberation movements are civic in orientation, ethnicity, language become secondary. If the liberation movement is sectarian, ethnicity and language become central. Okay? So let's go to the Somali case with that framework in mind. Okay? Somalis inherited of Somali, your culture, your dhaqan, your aado, which was, quote unquote, all similar. They inherited that commonality. Okay? Unlike anywhere else in Africa, the Somali land, as I call it, was almost the size of contemporary South Africa today. So it was huge, as I will show it in a minute. But Somalist literature, the literature on Somalia, particularly certainly in the English language, suggests that the Somali Republic was destroyed by traditional tribalism, and I underscore traditional here, traditional tribalism. The question, therefore, for us in this article is, if that's the case, if that's tribalism, traditional tribalism, qabiyalad ayaa baabiisay, then why not Kenya? Kenya is more ethnically diverse. Tanzania is more ethnically diverse. South Africa is more ethnically diverse. Ethiopia is more ethnically diverse. Why didn't it happen there? Okay. So our thesis is that it's not cultural differences or linguistic differences, but it is the poor quality of political leadership in the post-colony that either builds countries to prosper or pushes them towards their demise. That's our thesis in the article. And here is what I will do very quickly. So what was the Somali culture that people inherited? Common language across the territory. Poetry is the key. Decentralized patriarchal system. Okay? And Islam came later on. That was the culture we are talking about. Okay? But there are two features in that culture that we would like to extract. One is the way in which that culture, in an ecosystem, an environment that was sort of quite precarious to this day, okay? People adapted to that. So a Somali child, for instance, came to know more than 300 different plant species, their danger, our value for people and beasts to subsist in that challenging environment, an important factor. Second is a code of conduct, and this I will come back to it later on at the end. Code of conduct. Waad baahan tahay, looma bahalo cuno. You don't eat filth because you are hungry. It's a character code of conduct. That land, that tradition, this is what it looked like before the colonies came. Okay? The contrast is not quite good here, but you can see the map, right? Then there was the colonial encounter, and I'm rushing through here quickly. The Ethiopians are coming. The British are coming. The Italians are coming. The French are coming. Nowhere else in Africa did these kind of divisions will take place along these lines. Nowhere else. This is what that land became. Here, there were no borders. Okay? Here, there are the French Somaliland, Ethiopian Somaliland, British Somaliland, Italian Somaliland, the northern province, which was also British. 5 different colonies became what was the land of the Somalis before. So how did the Somali people as culture, not as a nation, react to this? How did they react to this? So imposition, if you like. And the first call, Fawzia may like this, and the first call came from Jigjiga, not from Mogadishu, not from Hargeisa, not from Wajer, not from Djibouti. And here's how a Somali poet at the tail end of the previous century, that's the 1800s, said, the British, the Ethiopians, the Italians are squabbling. The country is snatched and divided by whoever is strong. Quoted in the previous, Professor Saeed Samata in his 1982 book. That call, that plea from Jigjiga caught the ear of somebody who will become Sayyid Muhammad Abdullah Hassan. And the first war of liberation takes place in Jigjiga, not in Mogadishu, in Jigjiga, not in Djibouti, in Jigjiga, and not in Hargeisa. Okay? And Muhammad Abdullah Hassan uses 2 variables to mobilize the population, imagining a new society that did not exist before as an entity. Okay? One was, of course, Islam. Powerful religious man. He was intellect. Even more importantly was his poetry. Nobody like him. Okay? At that point in time. So here's what he says. In the name of God, if you follow me, in the name of God. He didn't say in the name of Somali. Okay? In the name of God, he says. If you follow me, with the help of God, I will deliver you from the Ahmara. Not from the British, because the first war of liberation takes place in Jigjiga. Then there's a long resistance. The longest liberation war in Africa at that point in time, from 1899 to 1920, 21 years, until Muhammad Abdullah Hassan perished in Imi from malaria. Okay? He was defeated in the battlefield, but his spirit to the last day was not broken. Okay. His ideas, therefore, this is what his accomplishment. Remember, we are talking about imagined communities. His ideas were not a Somali republic. It was not a Somali nation in the form of a state. It was Somalis free from foreign domination, period. Okay? He wasn't thinking about nationalism yet, but he begins to sort of sow the seeds of what will become the nationalist movement. What did the colonialists then do? They used 2 groups of Somalis, if you like, to manipulate them so that their authority as a colonizing power should be legitimated. Pay attention to this because it's with us to this day. And the first group was the so-called traditional leaders, Kaba Qabil, if you like. Okay? I'm an MP in Mogadishu. And boy, do I know this. Okay? And Ahmed can speak about Hargeisa. Okay? Traditional leaders became paid agents of the colonial state, the cog in the colonial wheel, if you like. And the second group was a small in number, where some religious leaders became Qadi court judges, school teachers, to give the colonial project a sort of, if you like, a cultural and Islamic hue to legitimate it. Okay? But with the perishing of Muhammad Abdullah Hassan for almost 20 years, 2 decades, from 1920 to almost to 1940, there was doldrums in the Somali world. There was no movement, resistance to the colonial project. Maybe in the form of silent resistance, but not certainly organized manner in that sense. But it was the Second World War that will create, if you like, the piston that will crack the Somali culture and begin to think of themselves as a nation, imagining, okay, it didn't exist before. And so it's during the war, as the Italian Somaliland was captured by the British, as British Somaliland was captured by the Italians before the British came again, those movements generated resistance in ways that Muhammad Abdullah Hassan and his colleagues did not think about at that point in time. So people will come together from all of the Somali colonies, 5 colonies, to Mogadishu to begin to agitate. And they are looking at what's happening in the rest of the world. It's at this point that the birth of what's called Somali nationalism takes root. It's right here. Okay. Consequently, Mogadishu will become the hub because of the United Nations. So people will come from Diridawa and Jigjiga. There was SYL in Diridawa. There was SYL in Jigjiga. There was SYL in Wajir. There was SNL in Hargeisa and in Bur'o, and so on and so forth, and USP. Okay, I'm moving fast. I see you. Okay. So 2 political factions after SYL and all of these things happens in the 1950s. A section that's sectarian in orientation and says, I want to be close to the British, I want to be close to the Italians, and I want to be this and this and that. Self-gratifying for themselves, and then dividing the nation as the British and the Italians and everybody else did. Okay? And then there is a civic group that says, we are all together here, and we want to imagine a new way of being Somali, a national Somali. But the Italians try to create tribal provinces, just like they have tribal provinces in Somalia today. Okay, Abdullah Isa writes about that at the United Nations. Okay, liberation comes. This is what the map becomes. Think about the Somali Republic. The Constitution says, the first article of the Republican Constitution in 1960 says the following. Somalia is an independent and fully sovereign state. It's a representative, democratic, and unitary state. The Somali people are one and indivisible. So unlike Muhammad Abdullah Hassan, which sort of germinated the seeds at the beginning, here we are talking about a national state, common citizenship, and so on and so forth, what the American sort of a liberation movement did, what the bourgeois did here. Okay? So a new imagination is coming to bear. Okay? Think about what this little boy is thinking about in Mogadishu. Even today, this is a very recent picture. What is he imagining? Who does he belong to? He doesn't have a tribal flag. He doesn't have a religious flag. He has a flag with a 5-pointed star. Okay? Muhammad Awal al-Liban, the inventor. Okay? Then democracy happens in Somalia, and there are 7 benchmarks, and I will conclude in a minute. Yeah, 5 minutes, that's great. Okay, you can read this, but there are 2 parts to this. When the country became a republic, there was a new constitution, British Somaliland and Italian Somaliland come together. There was no negotiation. There was no hustling. There was no haggling. I want this, put this one in the constitution for me. Everybody was willing to go along. They were new imagination. Okay? Unlike what's happening in the South today, unlike what's happening in the North today. Okay? But it's really the middle of that period in the 1960s with the local government elections of 1963, and then the presidential elections of 1967, and then the parliamentary elections of 1969. That's when the fracturing begins to take place. The 2 factions of the elite that we were talking about begins to take place. And then I have a document produced in 1969, early in 1969, from the Somali government, where all, quote-unquote, tribal leaders were brought from all over the country, okay? And they were told by the government, do our bidding in your communities. Let your communities come together, your clans come together, and vote as one for us. This is really the beginning of the germination of the 4.5 formula was in 1969. Okay? Take note. And then, of course, political tribalism begins to mushroom. Corruption begins to mushroom, which ultimately and unfortunately led to the demise and the killing of our president, Mr. Sharmak, in 1969. The military takes over. You know that story, many of you. The turning point was really the Somali-Ethiopian War. Tyranny and tribalization of the military itself. Mohammed Ali Samatar, the commanding general, told us in an interview in Minneapolis about, 2004 or thereabouts. That's exactly what happened, he said, the tribalization of the military. And then counter forces who were tribalistic in nature, SNM, sort of SSTF, USC, they all begin to mushroom. It wasn't people who were saying, we want to go and kill the Majertans, we want to go and kill the Isaks, we want to go and kill this and that. Okay? It was cooked from the top, not from the bottom. So if it was cultural, it should have emanated from here. Okay? That's where the leadership question takes place. And then, of course, the demise we are aware of. So the engineering of the calamity from the top started in the demise of Hargeisa, the killing of Hargeisa and Bur'o. Well, that's where it began. Okay? The military disintegrates, of course, regimes collapse, and the country falls apart. All of a sudden, we are in a new territory, all 2004 or thereabouts. That's exactly what happened, he said, the tribalization of the military. And then counter forces who were tribalistic in nature, SNM, sort of SSTF, USC, they all begin to mushroom. It wasn't people who were saying, we want to go and kill the Majertans, we want to go and kill the Isaks, we want to go and kill this and that. Okay? It was cooked from the top, not from the bottom. So if it was cultural, it should have emanated from here. Okay? That's where the leadership question takes place. And then, of course, the demise we are aware of. So the engineering of the calamity from the top started in the demise of Hargeisa, the killing of Hargeisa and Bur'o. Well, that's where it began. Okay? The military disintegrates, of course, regimes collapse, and the country falls apart. All of a sudden, we are in a new territory altogether. We are not in the territory where we were before the British and the Italians and everybody came. This is a new territory. Okay? And then Arta crystallizes this. The Arta, which we all celebrate, and they did some good stuff, but it crystallizes the tribalization of culture and the politicization of the tribe, if you like. That's the grammar that now runs the show in Hargeisa, that runs the show in Mogadishu, and anywhere in between. Okay. So how does this idea of 4.5, and this is my last sentence, how this idea of sort of a tribalized political organizations, how does it work? I'm a member of parliament. I'm giving you two examples that I have seen with my own eyes, present in parliament itself. Okay? And that's to say, parliament has committees. The British parliament has committees. So if I want to be a committee member of a parliamentary committee, I have to fit into the 4.5. Whatever Fawzia has in terms of qualifications and wisdom are irrelevant. That's how the parliament works today. Totally irrelevant. Fawzia, mo waxaad tahay habar yoonis baad. Haddaad habar yoonis tahay ama Majerten tahay ama Isaaq tahay ama ciidagala tahay, soo fadhiisa halkan. You belong. If you are outside that, out, even if she is the most qualified person in the place. Okay?
And what is outside that?
Huh?
Yeah,
Non-Somalis. Okay. So that's one way it works. In other words, we don't share anything anymore. Everything is about dividing. What the nationalist movement did was bringing people together. Here it's dividing it. Okay? And then the other way is employment in government, in Mogadishu, in Garawa, in Kismayo, in Baidawa, in Beledweyne, in Jowhar, in sort of anywhere else. And consequently, if you want to go and get employed in a government office, you have to have an aban, somebody who is your tribe, who will take you by the hand and say, "This is he should get our share, she should get our share." So the state itself becomes the victim. The state itself becomes the victim. And here we have ghettos. We don't have a nation anymore. We have ghettos. So the unmaking of the rise of the Somali nation, that's what we are talking about, the demise. The final state. The nation is almost dead. It's not dead. It's almost dead. Whether it's in Hargeisa or it's in Mogadishu. Okay? And so the question becomes, how can we, both as scholars but also as citizens, how can we rejuvenate something that respects all of us? Ahmed may have something to say about that. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Abdi. Just one quick announcement. If you are interested in following these things, academic things like this, this is essay which is now done and ready to go, follows another one which we wrote, so maybe Jam has mentioned this, about 2 years back. And the argument in that one was, at the heart of the Somali demise, it's not just nationalism, it's a whole society really that has broken up into fragments, is the loss of trust, amano, trust. And you can't build anything. You can't build a household if there is no trust, let alone a large society of 20 million people. Now, this paper then is part of a book or series of essays that we hope will come out in the near future. In that trust question, and I brought some copies if you are interested in this, we examined 4 institutions: culture, religion, politics, and public institutions. And the argument is that in all 4, the actors in the drama in culture, odayaasha waxa la yidhaaho, the actors in religion, wadaadada waxa la yidhaaho, the actors in politics, the political class, and then the public institutions, the administrative structure of the state, all of them, trust has evaporated. So none of them really works in a way that will build those societies. For the first time in a long time, I'm going to read what we have written and it's barely 3-4 pages. So we should be able to finish this quickly. So please maybe pay attention. The conclusion of the essay, it's a long essay, is that wretchedness and an effort to assuage it is the permanent drama that preoccupies most Somalis. I don't care where you are among the Somali community. Since the destruction of the Somali institutions that Abdi has spoken about, the Somali demos has all the characteristics of in itself, that Hegelian Marxist, in itself, but hardly any necessary awakening for itself. Way jirtaa, in itself. Lakin iskuma hadli karto. It cannot speak for itself. It is already 4 decades since the fatal decline and consequent evisceration of the dictatorship. In the moro of the repressive misrule of Mohammed Siad Barre's regime, the elite has cooked depraved Somali habits grounded in personal self-aggrandizing and instrumentalist calculations, part of the spirit that Abdi's evidence speaks to. Rather than seize opportunities to hold together in a mutually benefiting manner and the pursuit of their own interest, legitimate interest, and the imperatives of national unity, institutional integrity, and socio-economic well-being. The Somali elites in all places have transformed themselves into potentially what we call diseased political souls. The condition includes constant scheming to create discord, thus exploiting one another's vulnerability has become the defining feature of the elite in the defunct republic. In such if such is the main dialectic of experience, this question then arises. Can Somalis reinvent a common fidelity to a resurrective political community? Any genuine effort towards that goal would have to take intelligent cognizance of the unavoidable transition from this moment to some other place, the transition. And no one speaks better to that than when a great social scientist who for some time was, I think, the director of the London School of Economics, German professor by the name of Ralph Dandorf. He offers a sober reflection on the making of a society. And he writes, and I quote, "The clock of transition, the clock of transition runs at three paces. The hour of the lawyer is the shortest. Legal challenge may be enacted in months. You can go to parliament and say, okay, we change this, vote, done. The second one of the transition is the hour of the economist. And it's longer, a little bit longer. Why? Because dismantling and establishing functioning markets will sometimes takes years. But the longest one, and this is the big one for us, I think, as Somalis, the longest one is the hour of the citizen, he says. That is to say, transforming ingrained habits, mental attitudes, and cultural codes, self-value systems, pervasive discourses. This, he says, Darendorf, may take the hour of the citizen, may take decades, and presents the greatest challenge. End of quote. Now, Somalis now then locked into this kind of a critical crisis. The question then is there any way in which they can pick up the pieces, if not this generation, the generations to come, pick up the pieces so that they're able to create an agreement easily understood by the larger society, even in the face of various historical deprivations. Our argument, therefore, is, and this is the concluding segment of the paper, is that saddex kelmadood oo af Soomaaliya, 3 Somali words. And they are not just words, they are really concepts. Yeah? All concepts are words, but not all concepts, not all words are concepts. Yeah? All concepts are words. Yeah, whether it's Somali or English or German or Russian or Swahili, Arabic, all concepts are words, but not all words are concepts. The difference is that concepts, even though they are words, are pregnant with meaning, big time meaning.